At every stage, illuminated by knowledge, the will appears as an individual. The human individual finds himself in endless space and time as finite, and consequently as a vanishing quality. Compared with these, he is projected into them, and on account of their boundlessness, has always only a relative, never an absolute, when and where of his existence. For his space, for his place and duration are finite parts of what is infinite and boundless. His real existence is only in the present, whose unimpeded flight into the past is a constant transition into death, a constant dying. For this past life, apart from its eventual consequences for the present, and also apart from the testimony regarding his will that is impressed in it, is entirely finished and done with, dead, and no longer anything. Therefore, as a matter of reason, it must be indifferent to him whether the contents of that past were pains or pleasures, but the present in his hands is constantly becoming the past. The future is quite uncertain and always short. That his existence, even considered from the formal side alone, is a continual rushing of the present into the dead past, a constant dying. And if we look at it also from the physical side, it is evident that just as we know our walking to be only a constantly prevented falling, and is the life of our body only a constantly prevented dying, and ever deferred death. Finally, the alertness and activity of our mind are also a continuously postponed boredom. Every breath we draw wards off the death that constantly impinges on us. In this way, we struggle with it every second, and again at longer intervals, through every meal we eat, every sleep we take, every time we warm ourselves, and so on. Ultimately, death must triumph, for by birth it has already become our lot, and is placed with its prey only for a while before swallowing it up. However, we continue our life with great interest and much solicitude as long as possible, just as we blow out a soap bubble as long and as large as possible, although with the perfect certainty that it will burst. We have already seen in nature without knowledge her inner being as a constant striving, without aim and without test, and this stands out much more distinctly when we consider the animal or man. Willing and striving are its whole essence, and can be fully compared to an unquenchable thirst. The basis of all willing, however, is need, lack, and hence a pain, and by its very nature and origin, it is therefore destined to pain. If, on the other hand, it lacks objects of willing, because it is at once deprived of them again by too easy a satisfaction, a fearful emptiness and boredom come over it. In other words, its being and its existence itself become an intolerable burden for it. Hence, its life swings like a pendulum to and fro between pain and boredom, and these two are in fact its ultimate constituents. This has been expressed very quaintly by saying that after man had placed all pains and torments in hell, there was nothing left for heaven but boredom. But the constant striving which constituent constitutes the inner nature of every phenomenon of the will, obtains at the higher grades of objectification. Its first and most universal foundation from the fact that the will here appears as a living body with the iron command to nourish it. What gives force to this command is just that this body is nothing but the objectified will to live itself. Man, as the most complete objectification of this will, is accordingly the most necessitous of all beings. He is concrete, willing, and needing through and through. He is a concretion of 1,000 wants and needs. With this, he stands on the earth, felt to his own devices, in uncertainty about everything except his own need and misery. Accordingly, care for the maintenance of this existence in the face of demands that are so heavy and proclaim themselves anew every day, occupies, as a rule, the whole of human life. With this is directly connected the second demand, that for the propagation of the race, at the same time dangers of the most varied kinds threatens him from all sides, and to escape from them calls for constant vigilance. With cautious step and anxious glance around, he pursues his path, for 1,000 accidents and 1,000 enemies lie in wait for him, that he went in the savage state, and that he goes in civilized life. There's no security for him. In what gloom of existence, in what great perils, this life is spent as long as it endures. The life of the great majority is only a constant struggle for this same existence, with the certainty of ultimately losing it. What enables them to endure this wearisome battle is not so much the love of life as the fear of death, which nevertheless stands in the background as inevitable, but which may come on the scene at any moment. Life itself is a sea full of rocks and whirlpools that man avoids with the greatest caution and care, although he knows that even when he succeeds with all his efforts and ingenuity in struggling through, at every step he comes nearer to the greatest, the total, the inevitable and irremediable shipwreck, indeed even steers right onto it, namely death. This is the final goal of the wearisome voyage, and is worse for him than all the rocks that he has avoided. Now it is at once well worth noting that, on the one hand, the sufferings and afflictions of life can easily grow to such an extent that even death, in the flight from which the whole of life consists, becomes desirable, and a man voluntarily hastens to it. Again, on the other hand, it is worth noting that, as soon as want and suffering give man a relaxation, boredom is at once so near that he necessarily requires diversion and amusement. The striving after existence is what occupies all living things and keeps them in motion. When existence is assured to them, they do not know what to do with it. Therefore, the second thing that sets them in motion is the effort to get rid of the burden of existence, to make it no longer felt, to kill time, in other words, to escape from boredom. Accordingly, we see that almost all men, secure from what want and cares, are now a burden to themselves. After having finally cast off all other burdens, they regard as a gain every hour that is got through, and hence every deduction from that very life, whose maintenance, as long as possible has still then been the object of all their efforts. Boredom is anything but an evil to be thought of lightly. Ultimately, it depicts on the countenance real despair. It causes beings who love one another as little as men do, to seek one another so much, and thus becomes the source of sociability. From political prudence, public measures are taken against it everywhere, as against other universal calamities. Since this evil, like its opposite extreme, famine, can drive people to the greatest excesses and anarchy. The people need panem et circenses, the strict penitentiary system of Philadelphia makes mere boredom an instrument of punishment through loneliness and idleness. It is so terrible an instrument that it has brought convicts to suicide. Just as need and want are the constant scourge of the people, so is boredom that of the world of fashion. In middle class life, boredom is represented by the Sunday, just as want is represented by the 6 weekdays. Now, absolutely every human life continues to flow on between willing and attainment. Of its nature, the wish is pain. Attainment quickly begets satiety. The goal was only apparent. Possession takes away its charm. The wish, the need, appears again on the scene under a new form. If it does not, then dreariness, emptiness, and boredom follow. The struggle against which is just as painful as is that against want, for desire and satisfaction to follow each other at not too short and not too long intervals reduces the suffering occasioned by both to the smallest amount and constitutes the happiest life. What might otherwise be called the funniest part of life, its purest joy, just because it lifts us out of real existence and transforms us into disinterested spectators of it. It's pure knowledge, which remains foreign to all willing, pleasure in the beautiful, genuine delight in art. But because this requires rare talents, it is granted only to extremely few, and even to those only as a fleeting dream. Then again, higher intellectual power makes those very few susceptible to much greater sufferings than duller men can ever feel. Moreover, it makes them feel lonely among beings that are noticeably different from them, and in this way also matters are made even. But purely intellectual pleasures are not accessible to the vast majority of men. They are almost wholly incapable of the pleasure to be found in pure knowledge. They are entirely given over to willing. Therefore, if anything is to win their sympathy, to be interesting to them, it must, and this is to be found already in the meaning of the word, in some way excite their will, even if it be only through a remote relation to it, which is merely within the bounds of possibility. The will must never be left entirely out of question, only since their existence lies far more in willing than in knowing. Action and reaction are their only element. The naive expressions of this quality can be seen in trifles and everyday phenomena. That, for example, they write their names up to places worth seeing, which they visit in order thus to react on to affect the place. Since it does not affect them further, they cannot easily just contemplate a rare and strange animal, but I must excite it, taste it, play with it, just to experience action and reaction. But this need for exciting the will shows itself particularly in the invasion and maintenance of card playing, which is in the truest sense an expression of the wretched side of humanity. But whatever nature and good fortune may have done, whoever a person may be, and whatever he may possess, the pain essential to life cannot be thrown off. And again, I was the son of Zeus, of Cronos, and yet I endured unspeakable afflictions. The ceaseless efforts to banish suffering achieve nothing more than a change in its form. This is essentially want, lack, care for the maintenance of life, if, which is very difficult, we have succeeded in the removing pain in this form. It at once appears on the scene in 1,000 others, varying according to age and circumstances, such as sexual impulse, passionate love, jealousy, envy, hatred, anxiety, ambition, avarice, sickness, and so on. Finally, if it cannot be entirely in any other shape, it comes in the sad, gray garment of weariness, satiety, and boredom, against which many different attempts are made. Even if we ultimately succeed in driving this away, it will hardly be done without letting pain in again in one of the previous forms, and thus starting the dance once more at the beginning. For every human life is tossed backwards and forwards between pain and boredom. Depressing as this discussion is, I will, however, draw attention in passing to one aspect of it from which a consolation can be derived, and perhaps even a stoical indifference to our own present ills may be attained, for our impatience at this arises for the most part from the fact that we recognize them as accidental, as brought about by a chain of causes that might easily be different. We are not usually distressed at evils that are inescapably necessary and quite universal. For example, the necessity of old age and death, and of many daily inconveniences. It's rather a consideration of the accidental nature of the circumstances that have brought suffering precisely on us, which gives this suffering its sting. Now we have recognized that pain as such is inevitable and essential to life, that nothing but the mere form in which it manifests itself depends on chance, that therefore our present suffering fills place, which without it would be at once occupied by some other suffering which the one now present excludes, and that accordingly fate can affect us little in what is essential. If such a reflection were to become a living conviction, it might produce a considerable degree of stoical equanimity, and greatly reduce our anxious concern about our own welfare. But such a powerful control of the faculty of reason over directly felt suffering is seldom or never found in effect. Moreover, through this consideration of the inevitability of pain, of the supplanting of one pain by another, of the dragging in of a fresh pain by the departure of the preceding one, we might be led to the paradoxical but not absurd hypothesis that in every individual the measure of the pain essential to him has been determined once for all by his nature, A measure that could not remain empty or be filled to excess, however much the form of the suffering might change. Accordingly, his suffering and well-being would not be determined at all from without, but only by that measure, that disposition, which might in fact through the physical condition experience some increase and decrease at different times, but which on the whole would remain the same and would be nothing but that what is called his temperament. More accurately, this is called the degree in which he might be, as Plato puts it in the first book of the Republic. In other words, of an essay or difficult nature. In support of this hypothesis is the well-known experience that great sufferings render lesser ones quite incapable of being felt, and conversely, that in the absence of great sufferings, even the smallest vexations and annoyances torment us and put us in a bad mood. But experience also teaches us that if a great misfortune, as the mere thought of which we shuddered, has not actually happened, our frame of mind remains on the whole much the same as soon as we have overcome the first pain. Conversely, experience also teaches us that after the appearance of a long-desired happiness, we do not feel ourselves on the whole and permanently much better off or more comfortable than before. Only the moment of appearance of these changes moves us with unusual strength, as deep distress or shouts of joy, but both of these soon disappear because they stated an illusion, for they do not spring from the immediately present pleasure or pain, but only from the opening up of a future that is anticipated in them. Only by pain or pleasure borrowing from the future could they be heightened so abnormally, and consequently not for any length of time. The following remarks may be put in evidence in support of the hypothesis we advanced, but which in knowing as well as in feeling suffering or well-being, a very large part would be subjective and determined a priori. Human cheerfulness or dejection is obviously not determined by external circumstances, by wealth or position, for we come across at least as many cheerful faces among the poor as among the rich. Further, the motives that induce suicide are so very different that we cannot mention any misfortune which would be great enough to bring it about in any character with a high degree of probability, and few that would be so small that those like them would not at some time have caused it. Now, although the degree of our cheerfulness or sadness is not at all times the same, yet in consequence of this view we shall attribute it not to the change of external circumstances, but to that of the internal state, the physical condition. For when an actual, though always only temporary, enhancement of our cheerfulness takes place, even to the extent of joy usually appears without any external occasion. It is true that we often see our pain result only from a definite external relation, and that we are visible oppressed and saddened merely by this. We then believe that if only this were removed, the greatest contentment would necessarily ensure. But this is a delusion. The measure of our pain and our well-being is, on the whole, subjectively determined for each point of time according to our hypothesis, and in reference to this, that external motive for sadness is only what is blister is for the body, to which are drawn all the bad humors that would otherwise be spread throughout it. The pain to be found in our nature for this period of time, which therefore cannot be shaken off, would be distributed at 100 points, were it not for that definite external cause of our suffering. It would appear in the form of 100 little annoyances and worries over things we now entirely overlook, because our capacity for pain is already filled up by that principal evil that has concentrated at a point all the suffering otherwise dispersed. In keeping with this, also the observation that if a great and pressing care is finally lifted from our breasts by a fortunate issue, another immediately takes its place. The whole material of this already existed previously, yet it could not enter consciousness as care, because the consciousness had no capacity left for it. This material for care therefore remained merely as a dark and unobserved misty form on the extreme horizon of consciousness. But now, as there is room, this ready material at once comes forward and occupies the throne of the reign care of the day. If so far as its matter is concerned, it is very much later than the material of the care that has vanished. It knows how to blow itself out so that it apparently equals it in size, and thus, as the chief care of the day completely fills the throne, excessive joy and very severe pain occur always only in the same person, for they reciprocally condition each other, and are also conditioned in common by great mental activity. As we have just now found, both are brought about not by what is actually present, but by anticipation of the future. But as pain is essential to life, and is also determined as regards its degree by the nature of the subject, sudden changes, since they are always external, cannot really change its degree. Thus, an error and delusion are at the root of immoderate joy and pain. Consequently, these two excessive strains of the mind could not be avoided by insight. Every immoderate joy, exultatio, insolence, laetitia, always rests on the delusion that we have found something in life that is not to be met with at all, namely permanent satisfaction of the tormenting desires or cares that constantly breed new ones. From each particular delusion of this kind, we must inevitably later be brought back, and then it vanishes. We must pay for it with pains just as bitter as the joy caused by its entry was taken. To this extent, it is exactly like a height from which we can descend again only by a fall. We should therefore avoid them, and every sudden excessive grief is just a fall from such a height, the vanishing of such a delusion, and is thus conditioned by it. Consequently, we could avoid both if we could bring ourselves always to survey things with perfect clearness as a whole and in their connection, and resolutely to guard against actually leading them the color we should like them to have. The Stoic ethics aimed principally at freeing the mind from all such delusion and its consequences, and at giving it an unshakable equanimity. Instead, Horace is imbued with this insight in the well-known ode. Remember always to preserve equanimity when in adversity, and guard against overweening joy when in luck. But we frequently shut our eyes to the truth comparable to bitter medicine, that suffering is essential to life, and therefore does not flow in upon us from outside, but that every one carries around within himself its perennial source. On the contrary, we are constantly looking for a particular external cause, as it were a pretext for the pain that never leaves us, just as a free man makes for himself an idol, in order to have a master, for we untiringly strive from desire to desire, and although every attained satisfaction, however much it promised, does not really satisfy us, but often stands before us as a modifying error. We still do not see that we are drawing water with the vessel of the Danadas, and we hasten to over fresh desires. We hasten to ever fresh desires. For so long as we lack what we desire, it seems to us to surpass everything in value, but when it is acquired, it at once appears like something different, and in similar longing always holds us fast, as we thirst and hanker after life. Thus it goes on either ad infinitum, or what is rarer and already presupposes a certain strength of character, till we come to a wish that is not fulfilled and yet cannot be given up. Then we then have, so to speak, what we were looking for, namely something that we can denounce at any moment, instead of our own inner nature as the source of our sufferings. Thus, although at variance with our fate, we become reconciled to our existence. In return for this, since the knowledge that suffering is essential to this existence itself, and that true satisfaction is impossible, is again withdrawn from us. The consequence of this last kind of development is somewhat melancholy disposition. The constant bearing of a single great pain and the resultant disdain for all lesser joys and sorrows. This is in consequence a worthier phenomenon than the constant hunting for ever different deceptive forms, which is much more Euro.